"Bring the curvy woman to me now," the Mafia boss said in a voice so calm that every man in the room immediately stopped breathing, and no one dared ask why the most feared crime lord on the East Coast suddenly wanted an ordinary woman nobody considered important. The mansion overlooking the Hudson River fell into complete silence as dozens of armed guards exchanged nervous glances, knowing that when Alessandro Moretti gave an order without explanation, questioning him was often more dangerous than facing a loaded gun. Alessandro had built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars through ruthless discipline, calculated decisions, and absolute control, earning a reputation as a man who never allowed emotion to interfere with business. Rivals feared his name, politicians avoided crossing him, and even trusted allies rarely looked him directly in the eyes. Since losing his younger brother in a betrayal that nearly destroyed his organization 5 years earlier, Alessandro had buried every trace of kindness beneath layers of cold precision, convincing himself that attachment only created weakness. Yet this morning, something unusual had reached his ears. A frightened employee from one of his charitable foundations had whispered about a plus-size volunteer named Emily Carter, who had suddenly disappeared after confronting several influential men accused of abusing vulnerable women at a neighborhood shelter funded by the Moretti Foundation. Most people dismissed Emily as invisible because of her size, her simple clothes, and her quiet personality. But the frightened witness insisted she had risked everything to protect another woman from violence before vanishing without explanation. Alessandro did not tolerate anyone using his family name to hide cruelty, especially inside organizations created in memory of his late mother. And that single report was enough to interrupt an important meeting involving a multi-million-dollar shipping agreement. Across the city, Emily Carter sat silently inside the back seat of an aging sedan that smelled of gasoline and damp fabric, her trembling hands folded tightly across her lap as she stared through the window without seeing the passing streets. At 31 years old, Emily worked 2 jobs, volunteered every weekend, and spent most of her paycheck helping her widowed father pay medical bills. She had grown accustomed to cruel jokes about her body, awkward stares, and people assuming she lacked confidence simply because she wore plus-size clothing. But none of those humiliations had broken the kindness that defined her. What threatened to break her now were the dark bruises hidden beneath the sleeves of her cardigan and the painful marks spreading across her ribs after she had stepped between an intoxicated donor and a frightened young volunteer the previous evening. The influential men responsible had laughed as they warned her that nobody would believe someone like her over respected businessmen with expensive lawyers. They were certain her silence could be purchased with fear. They had underestimated the quiet courage that lived beneath years of rejection. Emily had refused every offer to keep quiet, and now 2 strangers claiming to represent the Moretti Foundation had insisted that someone important wished to speak with her immediately. She expected another interrogation, another accusation, or perhaps another attempt to pressure her into forgetting everything she had witnessed. She had no idea the destination waiting ahead belonged to one of the most powerful men in America. As the sedan passed through towering iron gates guarded by armed security, Emily felt her heartbeat quicken while her eyes filled with uncertainty. The mansion standing before her looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to survive a war. Inside, Alessandro remained perfectly still beside the enormous fireplace, his expression unreadable as footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Every guard instinctively stepped aside. Every conversation stopped. The heavy wooden doors slowly opened, and Emily cautiously entered the room with her head lowered, trying not to draw attention to herself. Alessandro looked up, expecting to question an ordinary witness, but the moment his eyes landed on the bruises stretching across her face, the purple marks visible beneath her sleeves, and the exhausted pain she was desperately trying to hide behind a polite smile, something inside the man who believed he no longer possessed a heart suddenly refused to stay silent. Alessandro Moretti did not raise his voice, yet every person inside the grand hall immediately sensed that the atmosphere had changed. His grey eyes remained fixed on the bruises covering Emily Carter's face, while the silence stretched so long that even the ticking of the antique clock became impossible to ignore. Emily lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the attention rather than the pain, instinctively pulling the sleeves of her cardigan farther down as though hiding the evidence could somehow make the room feel less uncomfortable. She had spent years pretending injuries were nothing more than accidents, because experience had taught her that people rarely wanted the truth if it complicated their comfortable lives. Alessandro slowly stepped away from the fireplace until only a few feet separated them, surprising every guard present, because no outsider had ever been allowed this close without extensive questioning. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated before offering the same answer she had repeated since childhood whenever someone noticed she was hurting. "I'm fine." Several of Alessandro's senior men exchanged knowing looks. They had witnessed their boss interrogate traitors, negotiate with dangerous rivals, and dismantle criminal organizations without showing the slightest emotion, yet none of them had ever heard him ask a question with such restrained patience. He studied Emily carefully, recognizing the difference between fear and deception. She was not protecting herself. She was protecting someone else from consequences she believed might become even worse if she spoke. Alessandro turned toward his chief of security, Marco De Luca. "Leave us." The command stunned the room. Marco hesitated for only a fraction of a second before signaling every guard to exit. Within moments, the enormous hall stood nearly empty, except for Alessandro, Emily, and a physician who had quietly arrived after receiving an urgent message. Emily immediately stepped backward. "I don't need a doctor," she insisted, forcing a small smile. "Please don't waste your time on me." Alessandro answered without looking away from her. "You are not wasting anyone's time." The physician gently asked permission to examine her injuries, but Emily instinctively flinched when he reached toward her arm. Alessandro noticed the reaction immediately. It was not fear of the doctor. It was the automatic response of someone who had learned to expect pain whenever another hand came too close. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The examination confirmed what his eyes had already suspected. Several bruises were fresh, one wrist had been badly strained, and there were signs that she had been shoved against a hard surface with considerable force. None of the injuries appeared life-threatening, but together they painted a disturbing picture. When the physician quietly finished, Alessandro dismissed him with a nod before returning his attention to Emily. "Someone attacked you." She remained silent. "Someone believed you would stay quiet afterward." Still she said nothing. Finally she whispered, "Some people have power. Other people don't." Alessandro's expression hardened. Everyone answers to someone. Emily looked at him with genuine confusion, unaware that she was speaking to the very man whose influence reached into boardrooms, shipping companies, charitable foundations, and political circles across several states. She assumed he was simply another wealthy executive connected to the foundation. "I already reported what happened," she said softly. No one wanted to hear it. Alessandro walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, his thoughts moving faster than anyone around him could have imagined. His late mother had founded the charity to protect vulnerable families because she believed kindness carried more strength than fear. If men connected to his own foundation had abused that mission while using his family's reputation as protection, then they had committed more than a crime. They had dishonored the one promise he had made at his mother's funeral. Without turning around, he asked one final question. "When you stepped between that volunteer and those men, were you afraid?" Emily answered honestly, "Yes." "Then why didn't you walk away?" She looked down at the fading bruise across her wrist before replying with quiet conviction, "Because she was even more afraid than I was." Alessandro slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment. In his world, courage was usually measured by firepower, loyalty, or the willingness to face death. Yet the woman standing behind him possessed none of those advantages and had still chosen to protect a stranger. That kind of courage could not be purchased, threatened, or negotiated. At that exact moment, Marco returned carrying a tablet containing surveillance reports collected from the shelter overnight. Alessandro reviewed the first images in complete silence until one frame froze him in place. The security footage clearly showed Emily stepping in front of a frightened young volunteer while 3 well-dressed donors aggressively surrounded them. Seconds later, the camera angle disappeared after someone deliberately disabled the recording system. Alessandro handed the tablet back without a word, but the icy calm in his face frightened Marco more than anger ever could. "Find every person who was in that room," Alessandro said. "Verify every financial connection they have to this foundation." Marco nodded immediately. "And if they try to leave the country?" Alessandro's answer came without hesitation. "They won't get the chance." Emily stared at him, finally realizing she had not been brought before an ordinary. Emily Carter stared at the marble floor as Marco De Luca disappeared through the heavy doors, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that she had just set powerful forces into motion. Alessandro Moretti remained perfectly composed, but everyone who had served him long enough understood the subtle warning signs. His shoulders were still, his breathing controlled, and his expression almost unreadable. Yet the cold silence surrounding him carried more danger than any shouted threat. Less than an hour later, reports began arriving from investigators stationed across New York, and each new discovery painted a darker picture than the last. 3 wealthy donors connected to the Moretti Foundation had quietly transferred large sums of money through shell companies during the previous 18 months, disguising payments as charitable expenses while intimidating employees who questioned the records. Witnesses who had tried to report suspicious behavior had either resigned without explanation or accepted confidential settlements to remain silent. The attack on Emily had not been an isolated act of cruelty. It appeared to be part of a carefully maintained system protected by influence, fear, and expensive lawyers. Alessandro studied every file in complete silence until one photograph caught his attention. It showed Richard Holloway, a respected businessman and one of the foundation's most celebrated donors, smiling beside several city officials during a fundraising gala only weeks earlier. Marco placed another folder on the desk. "Every witness mentions Holloway sooner or later," he reported. "No criminal convictions, plenty of rumors. Nobody has ever been willing to testify." Alessandro closed the folder without taking his eyes off the photograph. "Rumors don't interest me. Evidence does." Meanwhile, Emily sat in a quiet guest suite overlooking the river, where a housekeeper had brought fresh clothes, warm tea, and a first aid kit. The unexpected kindness made her more uncomfortable than the luxury surrounding her. She had spent most of her life believing generosity always came with conditions, and she struggled to understand why strangers were suddenly treating her with such respect. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, the bruises along her cheek seemed even more visible beneath the afternoon light. She instinctively reached for makeup before stopping herself. For years she had hidden every painful mark because explaining them always seemed harder than pretending nothing had happened. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Alessandro entered alone, carrying a small folder instead of the intimidating security detail that usually followed him. He placed the folder on the table without sitting down. "These are employment records from your volunteer program," he said calmly. Emily looked confused. "Why are you showing me these?" "Because 6 employees resigned after filing complaints that disappeared before reaching the board." Her expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. "You mean they told the truth?" Alessandro nodded once, and someone made sure no one listened. Emily lowered herself into the chair, suddenly realizing she had never truly been alone in what happened. The discovery offered comfort, but it also brought guilt. "If I had spoken louder," she whispered. Alessandro interrupted her before she could finish. "The responsibility belongs to those who caused the harm, not the person who survived it." The simple sentence struck Emily harder than she expected. No one had ever separated her pain from her responsibility so clearly. Before she could respond, Marco entered carrying another urgent report. His face revealed enough before he even spoke. "We have a problem." Alessandro accepted the documents and scanned them quickly. Security footage from nearby streets showed 2 black SUVs repeatedly circling the foundation shelter that morning. Phone records connected one of the drivers to Richard Holloway's private security company. More troubling still, investigators discovered that someone had accessed employee files only hours after Emily arrived at the mansion, suggesting that whoever orchestrated the attack already knew she was under Alessandro's protection. Alessandro's eyes narrowed slightly. "They aren't cleaning up evidence," he said quietly. "They're looking for her." Emily felt her heartbeat accelerate. Why would they still care? They already scared me away. Marco answered before Alessandro could. Because frightened witnesses can become brave if they believe someone powerful is finally listening. Silence filled the room. Alessandro turned toward the window overlooking the estate grounds, where dozens of guards had quietly doubled their patrols without explanation. Whoever stood behind Holloway was moving faster than expected, and that suggested confidence born from years of operating without consequences. Then another call came through Marco's encrypted phone. He listened for several seconds before ending the conversation. "One of the former employees agreed to meet our investigators," he reported. "She never arrived. Her car was found abandoned near the Brooklyn waterfront." Emily's face turned pale. Alessandro looked directly at her, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "From this moment forward, you do not leave this estate without my authorization." Emily immediately shook her head. "People are already getting hurt because of me." "No, Alessandro." The first drops of rain struck the mansion windows just after sunset as Alessandro Moretti stood alone in his private office, studying a wall of photographs, connected by handwritten notes, financial records, and surveillance images gathered over the previous 6 hours. What had begun as an investigation into the assault of one courageous volunteer had uncovered a network of intimidation stretching through charitable organizations, construction companies, and political fundraising events. Every trail eventually circled back to Richard Holloway, yet Alessandro knew experienced men like Holloway rarely operated without protection from someone even more powerful. Marco De Luca entered carrying a sealed evidence envelope recovered from the abandoned vehicle belonging to the missing former employee. Inside was a small flash drive hidden beneath the driver's seat, overlooked by whoever had searched the car. "Our analysts just opened it," Marco said. "You need to see this yourself." Alessandro inserted the drive into an isolated computer while security software scanned the files. Dozens of financial ledgers appeared alongside confidential emails documenting years of illegal payments disguised as charitable donations. But one folder immediately caught his attention because it was labeled simply with a single name: Emily. Alessandro opened it without hesitation. Instead of financial records, the folder contained scanned volunteer reports written over 3 years. Every report praised Emily Carter for protecting vulnerable women, organizing emergency housing, covering grocery expenses with her own paycheck, and quietly refusing public recognition. Several handwritten notes from staff described her as the first person to arrive during emergencies and the last person to leave after making sure everyone else was safe. Alessandro leaned back in silence. The woman who had apologized for taking up space had spent years creating safety for strangers while asking nothing in return. Marco quietly broke the silence. "She wasn't targeted because she was weak," Alessandro nodded. "She was targeted because she couldn't be bought." Across the mansion, Emily sat beside a guest room window, watching rain fall across the gardens while gently tracing the fading bruise on her wrist. The luxurious surroundings still felt unfamiliar, and despite the comfort offered to her, she could not stop worrying about the missing employee who had tried to come forward. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts before Alessandro entered carrying 2 mugs of fresh tea instead of another stack of questions. He placed one beside her without ceremony. "My mother believed tea solved more arguments than lawyers ever could," he said quietly. Emily managed the first genuine smile he had seen since she arrived. "She sounds wise." Alessandro looked out toward the rain. She believed strength meant protecting people who had nothing to offer in return. Emily lowered her eyes. "Then she was a better person than most people I've met." Before Alessandro could answer, Emily noticed an old framed photograph resting on a nearby bookshelf. It showed a younger Alessandro standing beside an elegant woman whose warm smile contrasted sharply with his serious expression. Fresh flowers rested beneath the frame. "Your mother?" she asked gently. Alessandro nodded once. Everything good I ever learned came from her. The brief conversation ended when Marco rushed into the room carrying another urgent report. "We identified the missing employee," he said. "She wasn't abducted. She's in protective custody with federal investigators." Alessandro frowned. "Federal investigators?" Marco handed him a document. "She contacted them months ago. She was collecting evidence against Holloway and someone inside our own organization." Emily felt the room grow colder. "Someone inside your organization helped them?" Marco answered quietly. "More than helped. Someone has been warning them before every internal audit." Alessandro's expression became unreadable as he reviewed the report. Access records showed confidential investigation schedules had been leaked repeatedly using executive credentials that only a handful of senior officials possessed. One name appeared too many times to ignore. Victor Moretti, Alessandro's uncle, the man who had helped raise him after his father's death, the man who sat on the Foundation's governing board, the man Alessandro had trusted for decades. Marco watched his boss carefully. "The evidence isn't complete yet." Alessandro closed the folder slowly. "It doesn't need to be complete for me to know this isn't a coincidence." Emily looked between the two men, realizing she had unknowingly become part of a conflict reaching far beyond the assault at the shelter. "If this is about your family," she said softly, "you don't have to keep protecting me. I'll leave tonight." Alessandro turned toward her immediately. "No." The single word carried absolute certainty. "This stopped being only about you the moment innocent people became targets." Emily searched his face, expecting to see obligation or guilt, but found only quiet determination. For the first time in years, someone was protecting her dignity before asking anything in return. At that exact moment, an encrypted phone on Marco's belt vibrated. He answered, listened for several tense seconds, then looked directly at Alessandro. "Our perimeter team intercepted an unmanned drone flying over the estate." Lightning flashed across the Hudson River as Alessandro Moretti gathered his most trusted advisors inside the mansion's secure operations room, where enormous digital screens displayed financial records, surveillance feeds, and photographs linked to the growing conspiracy. No one spoke until Alessandro placed the folder bearing Victor Moretti's name at the center of the table. "No assumptions," he said calmly. "Only facts." Marco De Luca nodded before presenting the newest findings. Bank transfers connected Richard Holloway's network to several consulting firms secretly controlled by Victor's longtime associates, while encrypted phone records showed repeated contact before every failed internal investigation. More disturbing still, tomorrow night's annual Moretti Foundation Gala would bring every major donor, board member and city official together under one roof. If Victor intended to destroy evidence or silence witnesses, the gala would provide the perfect opportunity. Alessandro closed the file and looked around the room. "We end this tomorrow night." While preparations quietly unfolded throughout the estate, Emily Carter sat alone in the mansion chapel, a small room lined with stained glass windows that glowed softly beneath the storm clouds. She had come searching for a few moments of peace, but her thoughts refused to settle. The missing volunteer was safe, yet countless others had suffered because powerful people believed they would never be challenged. She blamed herself for drawing Alessandro deeper into a conflict involving his own family. Footsteps echoed gently behind her before Alessandro entered without his usual security detail. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "You could still walk away from this." Alessandro looked toward the memorial candle burning beneath his mother's portrait. "If I walk away now, then everything she built becomes another weapon for people like Holloway." Emily lowered her eyes. "Your uncle may lose everything." Alessandro answered quietly. "If he's innocent, the truth will protect him. If he's guilty, my family name won't." Emily studied him for a long moment before saying, "Most powerful people protect their reputation first." Alessandro turned toward her. "I intend to protect people first." The sincerity in his voice left Emily unable to respond. For years she had believed kindness disappeared whenever money and influence entered the room. Standing beside Alessandro, she realized true strength could look remarkably different. The following evening, The grand ballroom of the Moretti Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as distinguished guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, unaware that dozens of Alessandro's investigators were quietly blending into the crowd. Emily wore a simple navy blue evening dress chosen by the house staff, elegant without pretending to be someone she was not. She hesitated before entering the ballroom, painfully aware of curious glances from guests who immediately recognized she did not belong to their social circle. Old insecurities threatened to return, but before doubt could overwhelm her, Alessandro calmly walked to her side and offered his arm. "Walk with me," he said. Every conversation softened as the most feared man in the room escorted Emily through the ballroom with complete confidence, making no attempt to hide her or explain her presence. Several influential donors exchanged uncomfortable looks, while Richard Holloway forced a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Victor Moretti approached moments later, greeting his nephew warmly, before his expression briefly shifted upon noticing Emily beside him. "I wasn't expecting another guest," Victor remarked pleasantly. Alessandro met his gaze without blinking. Neither were the people whose complaints disappeared. The warmth instantly vanished from Victor's face, replaced by careful restraint. Before either man could continue, Marco quietly signaled from across the ballroom. Everything was ready. Alessandro stepped onto the stage, prepared for the Foundation's annual address, thanking guests for their years of generosity, before pausing long enough to command complete attention. "Tonight," he said evenly, "we celebrate those who dedicated their lives to protecting vulnerable people. Unfortunately, some chose to exploit that mission instead." A large screen behind him illuminated with financial records, surveillance images, and testimony collected over the previous 24 hours. Murmurs spread across the ballroom as Richard Holloway's face appeared beside documented evidence of fraudulent payments and witness intimidation. Holloway immediately stood. "This is fabricated." Alessandro remained calm. "Then you'll have every opportunity to explain it." At that exact moment, federal investigators entered through the main doors alongside Foundation auditors carrying sealed evidence boxes. Guests stepped aside as agents approached Holloway. The businessman slowly smiled instead of panicking. "You still don't understand," he said, looking directly at Alessandro. "I was never the one you should have feared." Before anyone could react, the ballroom lights suddenly went dark. Gasps echoed through the room as emergency alarms activated, and security radios erupted with overlapping voices. Within seconds, backup generators restored partial lighting, revealing Emily no longer standing beside the stage where Alessandro had left her only moments earlier. His heartbeat stopped for a single terrifying instant as Marco's urgent voice came through his earpiece. "Boss, she's gone." Alessandro Moretti moved before anyone else inside the ballroom fully understood what had happened, his sharp eyes scanning every exit while security teams spread through the building with disciplined precision. "Seal every entrance," he ordered calmly into his earpiece. "No one leaves until Emily Carter is found." Panic threatened to ripple through the guests, but Alessandro's composed authority kept the situation from descending into chaos. Marco De Luca reviewed the security feeds restored by the backup generators and quickly discovered the truth. Emily had not been taken through the crowded ballroom. During the brief blackout, someone wearing a catering uniform had guided her through a service corridor after falsely claiming Alessandro had been injured. Realizing she had been deceived, Emily had broken away only moments later, leaving behind a fallen serving tray that security cameras captured just before the signal was interrupted again. "She's still inside the building," Marco reported. Alessandro immediately headed toward the lower service level beneath the ballroom, where unfinished corridors connected to storage rooms used during large events. The distant sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the concrete hallway. Emily stood backed against a locked maintenance door, while Richard Holloway blocked the only clear path forward. His confident smile had disappeared, replaced by desperation. "You should have accepted being invisible," he said coldly. "People like you survive by staying quiet." Emily's hands trembled, but she refused to lower her eyes. After everything she had endured, fear no longer outweighed her conscience. People stayed silent because they were afraid of losing everything, she answered. I already believed I had nothing left to lose. Holloway stepped closer, hoping intimidation would succeed where manipulation had failed, but before another word could be spoken, Alessandro appeared at the opposite end of the corridor. His measured footsteps echoed through the silence until he stopped between Holloway and the only remaining exit. It's over, Alessandro said evenly. Holloway glanced around, searching for an escape that no longer existed as Marco and several security officers quietly secured every hallway behind him. Even then, Holloway attempted one final gamble. Your empire survives because men like me protect it. Alessandro's expression never changed. My empire survives because people like her remind me what it's supposed to protect. Federal investigators entered moments later, formally taking Holloway into custody, as additional evidence recovered from his office confirmed years of fraud, witness intimidation, and financial crimes. At the same time, investigators questioned Victor Moretti regarding his role in concealing internal complaints. The evidence ultimately showed Victor had ignored repeated warnings to preserve the Foundation's reputation, allowing Holloway's misconduct to continue far longer than it should have. Though he had not orchestrated the violence, his failure to act carried serious consequences, and he quietly resigned from every leadership position before cooperating with the investigation. Days later, the Moretti Foundation announced sweeping reforms, independent oversight, expanded protections for employees, and confidential reporting systems designed to ensure every future complaint would be heard without fear. Alessandro insisted the changes be implemented before any public celebration, believing restored trust mattered more than repaired appearances. Emily returned to the shelter where she had volunteered for years, expecting little more than another ordinary morning. Instead, she found renovated facilities, additional counselors, and new programs funded through the Foundation. More importantly, the volunteers who once felt powerless now walked through the doors knowing their voices would not disappear into silence. As she thanked everyone for welcoming her back, Alessandro quietly arrived without an entourage or public announcement. He carried no expensive gifts, only a familiar dark coat folded over one arm. Seeing the cool autumn breeze, he gently placed it around Emily's shoulders, exactly as naturally as if he had done it 100 times before. "You don't have to keep pretending you're fine," he said softly. Emily looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes, not because of the bruises that had nearly faded, but because someone had finally seen the pain she had hidden for so long without asking her to become someone else first. "I spent years believing I had to make myself smaller so people would accept me," she whispered. Alessandro shook his head with quiet certainty. "The world became smaller whenever it failed to see your worth." Emily smiled through her tears, realizing that for the first time in many years she no longer felt ashamed of her reflection or afraid of her future. The frightened woman who once believed kindness would always be punished now stood beside a man who had discovered that true strength was measured not by fear, but by the people he chose to protect. Months later, as the Foundation opened a new community center dedicated to supporting vulnerable families, Alessandro publicly thanked Emily for the courage that had exposed the truth when so many others had looked away. The applause filling the room was not for wealth or power, but for compassion that refused to surrender. Together they stepped into the warm afternoon sunlight, no longer defined by Bruises, betrayal, or loneliness, but by hope, dignity, and the quiet promise of a new beginning built on trust. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one everyone fears, but the one who refuses to stop protecting others even after being hurt. If this story touched your heart, what would you have done if you were in Emily's place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next cinematic Mafia Boss story.